Welcome to Prepare For Takeoff. I'm the creator and host, Terry L. Cyrus. We're the podcast dedicated to amplifying Black excellence. Every week, we sit down with a proven professional or a rising entrepreneur. This week, we're sitting down with Maisa Tisdale, President and CEO of the Mary and Eliza Freeman Center for History and Community. Maisa, what's going on?
Hey, how are you?
Thanks
good for having me.
Thanks for giving us some of your time. I know you have a lot on your to-do list. You're a mover and shaker. You're Connecticut's very own, born and raised, and you are definitely making it your business to make people like myself and others aware of all of the rich history that exists in Connecticut, Bridgeport in particular. So first off, allow me to salute you just for all of what it is you do. I wanted to give you the opportunity to share all of that richness with all of our viewers and listeners. So with all of that being said, were you born in Bridgeport or were you born somewhere else in Connecticut?
I was born in Bridgeport, Connecticut, and my mother's family first came to Bridgeport right after the Civil War. And so we've all been born here for, 4 or 5 generations or so. My dad's family came up from Virginia during the Great Migration, during World War II. So I've been here a while. I grew up in the greater Bridgeport area.
So you guys are like 3 or 4 generations deep in Bridgeport.
Maybe 4 or 5.
4 or 5. Wow. So you guys are 4 or 5 generations deep in Bridgeport.
Right.
And the migration for your family happened 4 generations, even 5 generations ago. And many of my family members, we migrated from the South. As far as my immediate family, me, my brother and sister, we moved up here after graduation. I'm having attended West Virginia State University, all 3 of us. And then my mom's siblings, 2 of which they relocated to Long Island after they finished their high school studies in West Virginia. So it seems as though that's what kind of ties a lot of us together as far as people in the Northeast, no matter whether you're a 3rd, 4th, or 5th generation person from Connecticut, from New Jersey, from New York, chances are your lineage is going to either be traced back to the Caribbean or somewhere in the South.
Yeah, I mean, that's what's so interesting. So my mom's family came right after the Civil War. One branch of her family came from Barbados in the very early 1900s. So all of us have these very mixed and rich family trees. But what a lot of folks don't know is that one of the reasons people migrated to certain areas in Connecticut is because there were already Black communities there, people who had been there since colonial times, because slavery started in colonial times. And so there were both free Blacks and enslaved Black people who found themselves in Connecticut before Connecticut was a part of the United States.
So our history dates back to, well, and we should all know this, they brought us with them. And then they made stops in the Caribbean. And then there was a huge Native American population in the whole United States. So all of us have that mixed ancestry. But I think a lot of us aren't fully aware of that. And that's why the work that you do is so important, so people can understand and realize that we have a lot of shared history, not just with people who look like us, but maybe even some people who don't look like us. I know growing up, I was always told that we had Native American in us down our family tree, but didn't necessarily know where it was. I think I was able to trace my family tree to my great-great-grandparents. And that was only on my father's side.
Mm.
But on my mom's side, I think I was only able to trace it to really my great-grandparents. So, history and knowing where we come from is very important. So growing up in Bridgeport, what was that like for you?
Well, it's interesting because I was born in Bridgeport, but as I grew up, I always lived right on the Bridgeport line with other towns. So when I was a child, in what they called the Wonder Years back then, I lived on the border of Stratford and Bridgeport. So if you threw a rock across the street from Stratford, you were in Bridgeport. And then later on, we moved to Trumbull, same thing, right on the border. If you threw a rock across the street, it was in Bridgeport. But all of our lives centered on Bridgeport. When I was a little child, Bridgeport was still an industrial giant. So not only did Bridgeport have all the workplaces and the banks, it was a center of commerce, really busy, lots of transportation, airport, train, boats, cars, highways. And culturally, For Black people, it was where you literally were born, where you died, where you were baptized, where you got your hair done, where you went to church. It was the center of your life.
Then at some point you left Bridgeport and you attended Yale University. Is that correct?
Right. So 20 minutes down the highway or up the highway, up I-95.
Right.
I really didn't go very far.
Was there an adjustment period that you had to kind of deal with, or was it just smooth sailing just from what your educational experience had been up until that point?
So, yes and no. It was familiar, but it was different. Growing up in Connecticut, I grew up when I was up through middle school, I lived in an area where no one's grandparents spoke English. All right. So a working class immigrant white neighborhood. So there still weren't many Black people, but it was working class white people. And Black people were actually segregated. I grew up in these co op apartments, and Black people were segregated and put in certain buildings. But no one's grandparents spoke English. Everyone but the Black people were Catholics. So then I went to a middle school that was quite elite. And this was because of my parents' involvement in the civil rights movement. And that had a lot to do with how I regarded my experience at Yale. I felt that, first of all, my parents made me aware of my history from the time I was a little child. And I felt like the labor of our people had made it possible for the wealthy to have institutions like Yale. Later on, I found out that they were absolutely right in terms of all of these books that are written about the way that the endowments of these institutions were really drawn from the slave trade and profits from slavery. So, in fact, my family, my lineage had built that university. I also was very aware, because my parents were civil rights activists as well as public historians, that they had fought literally for my right to enter these institutions that were discriminating against qualified Black people just because of the color of their skin. And then at Yale, there was another layer, because Yale had been all men. And it was the only Ivy League school that didn't have a sister school. So I was also among one of the early classes that had admitted women. So to be Black and a woman at Yale was an interesting experience. And some of the professors welcomed our presence, but some of them did not at all.
I didn't know that they had that history as far as being an all-male university. Did a lot of those changes come post-civil rights or prior to the civil rights movement?
No, they came post-civil rights. So there were some women in some of the graduate schools, just as Yale has had some Black people, and especially the graduate schools from early on. But in terms of being part of the undergraduate student body, that wasn't an opportunity that was offered.
At one point in time, were all of the Ivy Leagues, were they all male, or did Yale have that distinction of being the only all-male university in the Ivy League community?
So the Ivies tended to be male schools with corresponding sister schools. So Harvard had Radcliffe, Brown had Pembroke, and so on.
Now, were they inviting to you, or was it something that you had to kind of navigate, or you just knew like, hey, I'm gonna brush it off my shoulder. It is what it is. No matter what they want, it's more about what I'm going to obtain or as a result of, attending a school of this magnitude.
Well, it depended on what major you chose.
Okay.
And Yale also has a college system. So Harvard, they call it a house system. At Yale, they have a college system where in freshman year, you all live on the old campus, right? And then beyond your freshman year, you're divided into colleges. No sorting hat like Harry Potter, but you're divided into different colleges. And then the rest of your college life, you live and you eat in these residential colleges. And each has its own history. So it depended on, each college had a master And it depended on how open-minded the master of your house was, your college was. And it also depended on your major, how welcoming the head of that department was. So
Mm.
you're probably going to ask me what my major was. And if my department was welcoming, I decided on a Chinese studies major, and they were not welcoming. At that point in time, they were not welcoming because it was when I said what my major was, people would laugh and they said, that major, people become missionaries or CIA agents. That's what they become. I know that was true, but I do know that it was one of the departments where the old guard there, the old faculty members, you could tell that they just yearned for the days that Yale was male and white.
What led you to choosing that major? Like, did you have any aspirations for being a CIA, officer
Or,
or
or
or,
missionary?
or
No, I didn't
missionary?
want to be a CIA agent or a missionary. I I grew up, my parents made a point. In fact, they created a local institution in arts and cultural program that allowed us to just be fully immersed in arts and culture of the African diaspora, right?
Okay.
And when I went to college, I was really interested in being an African or an African studies major, and Yale didn't offer those at that time. So I wanted to learn more about the world. I mean, in elementary school and in high school, you learn all about European culture. The education is very ethnocentric in that way. My parents had spent all of these years just immersing me in African and African American culture and history of the diaspora. And then when I went to Yale, it wasn't really possible for me to have a major at that time. So I talked to my godmother, who was actually a woman and a PhD from Dar es Salaam in Tanzania. And I said, Mandina, I don't know what major I should take. And well, she said, you have an opportunity to learn about China. And at that time, this will date me, but the United States had no diplomatic relations with the People Republic of China. They only recognized Taiwan as China. And she said, Tanzania does have diplomatic relations with the People's Republic of China. And just think, if you become a Chinese studies major, entire libraries of works and books that no one in your country has read. And she said,
Mm.
someday the US will have to recognize China. And you will already have learned about that country. You'll already be in the forefront of that field. Because I was toying between an an Arab studies major and an Asian studies major. And she told me that as a woman who had traveled through Arab nations, she knew that it was hard to interact with that culture as a woman, with many of those cultures as a woman. And she found that the Chinese at that time were more egalitarian where men and women were concerned. And she said, one day they'll open and you'll be able to explore that nation and that culture and learn about something other than United States history or European history.
What field did you find yourself venturing into once you obtained your degree from Yale?
Well, it's really interesting because when I went to college, a lot of the parents of my colleagues, of my peers, had said, they better know exactly what they're going to do when they graduate with this really expensive degree. And my parents didn't feel like that. They felt like undergrad was the one time where you really had the opportunity to just really learn, where you didn't have to force yourself into one area or the other. And they really encouraged me to look at college as the time for exploration. They felt for certain that by the time I embraced something that I really loved, that I would strive toward excellence and be creative enough to find my niche, to identify something that I could do that would make a living in that field that maybe no one else would have imagined. So a lot of people said to them, "Oh, you're letting her major in that? She's never going to find a job," right? And even
Haters.
within, yeah, and even within the Chinese studies department, only one professor, no, I'll say two, were supportive of my being there. And the others basically said the same thing. Since I wasn't a white male, there was no place for me in the sorts of careers where they were placing white males with these majors. And one even said to me, "Why are you taking these courses anyway? Do you have a Chinese boyfriend, a little sweetheart honey honey?" I mean, that was just so insulting. It couldn't
Absolutely.
be because I wanted knowledge, that I was taking advantage of a curriculum that this university offered that so many others did not. So interesting how things come together. And I found this through my life that I didn't really plan. I did follow my interests. And that brought me into contact with other people who either had connections in the field or shared similar interests, and found it sort of fascinating that I had that interest too. And so, to that extent, my sticking out like a sore thumb was also something that allowed me to progress, because they didn't expect to meet a young Black woman with a degree in Asian studies with a specialty in China who didn't straighten her hair even. Like, I didn't fit into any of the preconceived stereotypes of someone who had an interest in this field. So I sort of stood out. I also had a strong interest in international studies of all kinds and in the United Nations. And so this is one of the odd things about Connecticut. Tiny state, one of the wealthiest states in the country, but the cities, the urban areas where there are more Black and Brown people, they frequently appear on the list of the poorest cities for their size, right? So in the south end of Bridgeport, where the Freeman houses are, where Little Liberia was, where we do our work, the median annual family income is in the 12th percentile, the 12th percentile. So it's one of the lowest income areas, not just in Connecticut, but in the nation. But Connecticut's a little state. And during the years that my parents fought the civil rights battle nationwide, and also within the state of Connecticut, which is still to this day more segregated than any southern state, they met people who were allies and who were progressive. And one of these women, her name was Ruth Steincross Cohen. And her father was one of the people who created the United Nations. And she lived and breathed the highest aspirations of that institution. And she had also been a secretary for Eleanor Roosevelt. Anyway, she saw that I had all of these interests, and my parents had cultivated them. When I was a little kid, my dad bought me two really interesting things. He bought me this, I guess it was just actually a cheap tin sort of globe, right? And I would spin it around and just stick my finger down there. And I realized one day, it dawned on me that you could actually go to these places. And so I would go to my room and play and spin the globe and put my finger on the place and then pretend that I jumped in the globe and I was there. And my dad also won an award when my parents married really, really young. And as I believe he was the state's highest seller of World Book encyclopedias. So we had this great set of World Book encyclopedias. And when I would jump into this globe and end up at this place, I would go and get the World Book encyclopedia and open it up, right? So he also gave me a book of fairy tales that was written in French. It had French, and then under the next line, it would have the phonetics for how to pronounce the words in French. And then it would have the English. So I always had this interest in other places that my parents really, really cultivated. And Ruth Steincross Cohen saw this, and she also just loved my parents. And we joined the United Nations Association. So all my life growing up, there were people from the UN, international students and diplomats staying in our little apartment because they would have home hospitality, and we weren't that far from New York City. Just an hour out of Harlem, an hour and a half from Midtown Manhattan by train. So we had all of these people in our house, plus the folks that were associated with the civil rights movement. And my mother founded an arts organization. And so we had all these luminaries from the arts and cultural world of the African diaspora. So what happened was my last year at Yale, I get a call from someone who identifies himself, again, dating myself, as Richard Nixon's interpreter when he went to China. And he says, I'm calling from the State Department because we want to send the editor of the Peking Daily to your house. I thought it was a friend.
He was like, stop playing. Who's this playing on my phone?
He had to actually call me back.
Yeah, like this isn't the game.
He said, no. Ruth Steincross Cohen gave me your name. The editor of the Peking Daily doesn't speak any English, but he wants to stay in an American home. And we need some, but he doesn't want to stay with a Chinese person. And we were told by Mrs. Cohen and your professor that you speak Chinese. Can we send him to your house for the weekend? We understand that your parents always take international visitors anyway.
They had all the tea.
Right? I'm like, sure. So he comes to our house and stays a 3-day weekend. And he goes to our arts and cultural organization, which was called Youth Bridge. And my mom started that right after Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated with Paul Newman and June Havoc, who, if you ever saw the play Gypsy, Baby June, that was this woman, right? And so my mom had wanted to start a cultural organization for the longest time. And people, their awareness was raised after the assassination, not so different from what happened after George Floyd was murdered. And she was able to write grants and start this cultural organization, which became sort of the center of my life. I was fortunate enough, our little apartment was full of people like luminaries. Catherine Dunham came and got snowed in during a blizzard and couldn't go home. Paul Newman drank beer at the table with my dad. It was like really funny. But the people who came through this program enriched me so, and all of us. Wole Soyinka came through, Derek Walcott, and on and on and on. People who just came through this program. So the editor, we took him to the arts workshop. He sat in an African dance program right next to the drummers. And that Sunday morning, he was looking to help cook. And he said, I love your family. It's like a Chinese family. You have all the generations under one roof because we were an extended family. And he said, I want to cook too. And so then he's looking around for something he knows how to cook. He goes, I can cook those. And you know what he was pointing at? It's He says, we eat these all the time.
Man.
So he made the grits for the brunch. And the next day he had a press conference and he said, oh, you come too. And so unbeknownst to me, there was that interpreter from Richard Nixon's trip to China was actually in the room. And he said later on, I noticed your rapport with all of the people in the room. And they were from different countries and from different walks of life. And the editor was laughing and we were joking. And he said, have you considered working for the State Department? And I said, no, I haven't, because I don't agree with most of the, positions that our government has been taking. You realize this was just after Vietnam, right? And so he said, well, we have private contracts. And it's important to us for these private contracts to have people who represent a spectrum of views. people with all kinds of views, because we want to show people from other nations the diversity and the diversity of American people, and also the fact that the United States permits an entire spectrum of thoughts, that we don't use propaganda or require people to think a certain way. And you would be perfect for this program. You don't have to change a thing. You don't have to toe the party line. The program overall has a balance, and it's in the Department of Educational and Cultural Affairs. And so I didn't call him back for a year because, you come out of college, I'm like, private contractors, State Department, weren't those the guys shot down in Vietnam when they said nobody was in Vietnam?
Right.
But I was looking for a job for a year, and my parents said, well, why don't you go? It's good to practice interviewing, and this is a different kind of interviewing process. And you probably won't get the job anyway because of our background in civil rights. But go, it's different, try it. So I did, and I learned about the program, and it was a wonderful program. And I worked as a private contractor on and off for a long, long time. It was the kind of thing that you could do once a year for 1 month, or you could do it, more or less full time. And as part of that program, it was part of the Fulbright program that brought international people to the United States. And it was considered critical, really important to international relations and to the nation's strategic interests, because the attitude then was that whether you agree with people in different countries or not, they're going to make decisions that have an impact on the United States, no matter what their field is.
Regardless.
Whether they're artists or they deal with nuclear disarmament, whether they're looking at climate change or they're looking at, how you build a dam. These people will have some kind of an impact on our lives in the long run. So this particular program targeted mid-career professionals who showed themselves to be playing a prominent role in their country. I ended up traveling around the United States because the idea was that they would come here, they would have sort of a really, really demanding course that familiarized them with the work that Americans were doing in their fields. And then they would go around the country to meet with their US counterparts. It was so important to the administrations at that time that these programs not be controlled by any kind of political dogma or point of view, that it was supported by both parties, and no government office within the United States was allowed to program these study tours, you can call it that. They would have bids by nonprofits, and whoever came up with the most balanced and diverse program for these folks, those are the ones who would get the contract. So I ended up seeing 49 of the 50 states and many tribal nations here. I traveled with people from maybe 160 different countries. And my role, first of all, was to make sure that nothing went wrong. And if anything did go wrong, that it got fixed. And also to evaluate the programs so that they would always get better. But what that did for me is it meant that I was sitting in the room for every course, every workshop, every seminar, every meeting that they had, whatever the field was. And I literally had programs that were everything from nuclear disarmament to modern dance.
Man.
So what I learned from that, I learned the importance of culture. I learned the importance of the exchange of cultural information, and that we were not necessarily familiar with our own country and the diversity within. And that diversity gave it strength. I saw different kinds of people doing different kinds of work in every imaginable field. And then I saw the regard that people from other countries held us in because of that. And these programs were so inclusive and balanced. I met Black folks doing work that I never thought we did, or I didn't even know it existed. But this idea that you go to college, you don't necessarily specialize in college, but you identify what your interests are. And then because of that, people both take notice, but also you have the creativity and the expertise to identify a niche that no one else really has.
Thinking about starting your own business? Make it real with Shopify, the all-in-one platform trusted by millions to sell online and in person, whether it's merch, art, or digital goods. Shopify gives you the tools to build, grow, and succeed. And here's the best part. When you sign up using the affiliate link in our show notes, you're supporting Prepare for Takeoff and starting your business off right. Click the link and start your free trial today. You didn't go to Yale and say, I can major in investment banking or whatever. You went there with an exploratory mindset. And then you maintain that exploratory mindset after you graduated, and you're still embracing that exploratory mindset as it pertains to the path that you find yourself on with the work that you're doing in Bridgeport, as far as the preservation of Little Liberia, which we want to talk to you about, and then these women that bears the name of your center. I'm sure our viewers and listeners will love to hear about it. The significance of Little Liberia, the significance of this community, and how it was a destination on the Underground Railroad many years ago. That was one of their North Stars. Hence the name Bridgeport. It served as a bridge for people to port to.
That's true. That's very true. Yeah. So, as you know, as you've noticed, I have an exploratory kind of nature, right? And I also have just such a love of history. I also see how culture and science and finance and all of those things fit together to identify, who people are and what they aspire to. So, Little Liberia, first of all, the people who lived there, they just referred to the place as Liberia. It was settled in 1821. So think about 1821. 21, Connecticut was still a slave state. 21, the nation was a slave nation that embraced slavery. And in 1821, many indigenous people had been exterminated by genocide. So in 1821, if you were born Black or indigenous, you could say nothing was going in your favor. So
Right.
90% of all Black people were in shackles in 1821. So what we see is that the area that we call Little Liberia today, that name seems to have emerged in the 20th century to distinguish it from Liberia, the nation, Big Liberia.
Right.
The area, the 15-block area, was referred to as Ethiop, it looked like from outsiders. So Ethiop, land of people with burnt faces. And think about it, in 1821, there weren't many names for Black people that weren't derogatory. So Ethiop, not a bad name. But what we start to see is that this name Liberia takes hold. And Liberia means free land. So by 1848, we're seeing the people, the Black and indigenous people who inhabit this settlement, who founded this settlement, referring to their settlement as free land, which is ironic considering that the nation has embraced slavery, and slavery begins to phase out in Connecticut in 1848. Now, most people say it did phase out in 1848, but what we have found is that this gradual emancipation only applied to certain people. So even after 1848, there were Black folks in the state of Connecticut who were still enslaved.
Now, why was that?
Well, you had to be born during certain years and of a certain age to be part of the gradual emancipation that Connecticut said would free people 1848. But if you weren't born within that window, so you could still be enslaved. So what you would have is sometimes a child would meet the requirements for gradual emancipation by 1848, but their parent would not have.
Oh, I see.
So it wasn't just a freedom date where everyone was freed.
Kind of almost like immigration, where the parents may be illegally undocumented, but their children, the citizens by way of being born here. So I guess to some extent it was some of that, there.
Yeah, it was similar to that, but it shocks a lot of people who live in Connecticut because we grew up in school being told that the North was free and the South were slaveholding states, and the people in the North, they were Underground Railroad. We were basically taught that. White people, nice, kindly white people, ran the Underground Railroad and they freed us and brought us up from the South and freed us. But in reality, what we have found through the study of this settlement, and this is one of the things that's so significant, is that the people who created this place that they called Liberia were very, very much involved in the colored conventions movement. The colored conventions movement was a movement of free Black people nationwide and some from even outside of the country who were dedicated to abolition and the end of slavery. They were the ones who created the Underground Railroad and found white allies to help. And that kind of makes more sense. I know that I always wondered, well, how does somebody sitting in the middle of Connecticut know how to free people
Right.
from enslavement in the South?
Right.
We use GPS just to drive south, right? How do you know how to disentangle people
Right.
from enslavement if you're just up here in the North? And it turns out that these were white allies who joined with members of the free Black community to help people self-emancipate. So whether you came on the Underground Railroad or you came before that, and many of the people who settled in Little Liberia did, this became a destination that people knew about. So how did they know about it? Well, one of the ways they knew about it was because of how much Black people traveled. And we think about it nowadays, we think we're the ones who traveled, right? Because there are planes and things like that, cars. But these folks were traveling up and down by boat. So a lot of the men who lived in Little Liberia were seamen. They sailed for a living, both for themselves and for business enterprises much larger than themselves. So one of the men in Little Liberia fought pirates in the China Sea. They sailed all up and down the eastern seaboard. They actually moved among the same slave triangle the triangle that was used for slavery. They used that for trade and emancipation and for smuggling people. So that also allowed them to have the finances needed to be independent and to be able to put into a movement of this kind. So the sea was the only place that Black men could make the same amount of money as white men. So that's what they did. Now, the women, on the other hand, became extremely entrepreneurial. They took money that they made as free women in different enterprises, and they also invested the money in the purchase of land in this community. And they did real estate development. So Mary and Eliza Freeman, the sisters whose homes we own, they built them in 1848, and they actually developed other real estate in the area, places for other people to come and live. They had a mortgage system financing people, and they were really, really not only entrepreneurial, but very sophisticated in their use of the banking and the legal system. And I'm still not sure I understand how or why. Now, we couldn't go to business school back then.
Right.
So where did they learn about wills and deeds and bank accounts and things like that. And furthermore, why did certain institutions allow them to participate? Because a lot of these institutions were highly discriminatory. So, what was it that allowed this community to use and understand the legal and the banking systems of that time? So, you have a community that builds itself in Bridgeport, Connecticut, which is the south end of what's now Bridgeport, Connecticut, 15 blocks. So, from the railroad tracks to the Long Island Sound, from what is the Bridgeport Harbor over to a street that you folks don't know, but Lafayette Street. And you have 15 square blocks. They build housing and businesses, and they manufacture things and build boats, and they also trade with people outside of their community. So they have business with white people outside of their community. How is this? Why is this? This is something that we're still trying to understand. But just to give an idea, Mary Freeman, when she passed away, the only person in Bridgeport who had more money than she was P.T. Barnum. She and her sister could have been living in mansions, but they lived in very nice and centrally located, simple working class homes. But the homes were commissioned and had an architect who built them. When people go in them now to look at the kinds of techniques that were used, they find that they were advanced. The roofs were made of metal, which was shocking to all of us. They had metal roofs then? But they did. Their roofs were made of metal. And we also see adaptations that they made for the fact that they lived in a part of town that flooded. Right. So they're actually lessons that we can learn today that apply to the kind of climate change and sea level rise that this neighborhood still experiences. So this was a special place. And we see sort of the emergence of what will be the foundations of the civil rights movement as we know it, coming out of the colored conventions movement in Bridgeport, which had the second largest delegation to the colored conventions movement of any other Connecticut city.
And when you think of people being freed from the South, the first people that you think of are Nat Turner, you think of Harriet Tubman, and you just kind of picture them running through these desolate areas, through these wooded areas, and hopefully they're not being chased and caught by slave catchers. But I'm sure that our viewers and listeners, myself included, we didn't realize how enterprising we were as people to say, you know what, we can use the sea to our advantage. We can use the sea to get people from point south to north.
Exactly.
And it's less of a risk for them. And now, let me ask you this question, similar to what it is now with immigration. Now, would people come to those communities, people who didn't look like us, would they come to those communities and say, okay, well, when I first came here 2 years ago, it was only about 10 of y'all. You 55 deep. How did that happen? And who's free and who isn't free? How did they make the distinction in determining who was free in Little Liberia?
So from what we can tell, they were concerned about that. When the Fugitive Slaves Act went, we think that there was concern about that in writing at the time. But Little Liberia was a large community, especially for that time. So they had over 30 structures. They had churches, 2 churches. They had a school for colored children. They had all of these businesses. There were over 300 people there, which was, again, large for that time. And it even predated the chartering of Bridgeport as a city. It was a little isolated. It's not isolated now, but it was then. A lot of the land that surrounds the footprint of Little Liberia actually wasn't there. So they were on the water. There were waterways, little waterways that crossed Little Liberia. And then to the north was what they described as an impenetrable swamp. So they were very isolated, which allowed them to come and go with these vessels. Also back then, looking at the writings of white people at that time, they considered it unhealthy to be that close to the water.
I see.
So here you have this community that's rather isolated in an area that people wouldn't necessarily go to, with lots of water, which is considered unhealthy. They weren't really keeping a big eye on that community. So imagine if you were self-emancipating and you ended up in this place. Well, you were in a place where there were already Black and Native people. I don't know that they noticed that there were that many more.
Mm-hmm.
But as the community started moving northward, because it did keep getting more and more populated, and the city of Bridgeport started moving south, and there were designs on the land for industrialization later on, they became very aware that there were so many people there. And the state as a whole was not welcoming to Blacks who were coming up from the South during and after slavery.
Mm-hmm.
So the state went through a lot of trouble to take away the civil rights of Black people in Connecticut. So Connecticut is kind of a quirky place. Connecticut was the last state to abolish slavery of the New England states. Connecticut was the last New England state to allow Black people to vote. In fact, it never did. Black people in Connecticut got the right to vote when the Constitution was changed to allow the formerly enslaved to vote. And there was a lot of talk in the State House about the need to discourage Black people from coming from other places and settling in Connecticut. Connecticut had segregation laws. It passed its last segregation law in 1936.
That's crazy.
And I believe there were still literacy tests for people from Puerto Rico into the 1970s.
Were you had to like count jelly beans and all of the stuff that you associate Mississippi with, but it was happening here in the Northeast.
Right.
To me, it kind of sounds like Connecticut is the East Coast version of Missouri. Yeah, and Missouri is the most northern southern state in the country. Even though it sits north, but many of their views are very southern in nature. And I will say, when you think of the tri-state area of the three states, Connecticut is the more conservative of the three. And so I'd say some of those traditions still, they still seem to remain, but obviously it's not what it was back then. No, all this is all news to me. But you touched on something before, and I don't want to assume that our viewers and listeners, I don't know how and why they wouldn't know who P.T. Barnum is and the significance of who he was and how and why this woman was only second to him in her net worth. So if you don't mind, explain to our viewers and listeners who he is and kind of how and why that's so significant.
Who P.T. Barnum is?
Yes.
Okay, so P.T. Barnum, really interesting character. He was self-made, right, in the 1800s, and he basically lived at this interesting transitional time in the United States. So this change from a slave society, a society that built its economy on enslavement of Black people, to the post-Civil War society. So P.T. Barnum was born in Connecticut, and he was a businessman. Now, a lot of people know him as a circus man, but he created that circus actually in his retirement. But before that, he prided himself on being a self-made man. And he had all kinds of businesses. He created a museum in New York City. Before he died, he was creating a science institute or academy here in Bridgeport. But his is an interesting story. It's far more complex than most people know, because early in his days, he actually was a slaveholder. And proud of how he had parlayed, like, it's kind of like flipping a house, how he had managed to make money off of a transaction. But during the days that he had his museum in New York City and his circus, he had different sorts of acts and exhibited oddities. This allowed him to attract attention from all over Europe, where he traveled with his circus and met kings and queens and really elite people. And it allowed him to sort of, again, change his social status. The thing about P.T. Barnum was, though, his journey was a theme that I think people miss is one of redemption, because he talks in later life about how he hadn't really given much thought in the time that he held, you know, he was a slave holder. He had two enslaved people, that he was just sort of caught up in the culture of the time. And he was an excellent marketer. And he had his pulse on his finger on the pulse of American popular culture. So in many ways, he's a reflection of all of I would say actually the worst sort of sides of elitism and racism and thoughtless capitalism.
Mhm.
But in Bridgeport, he also became the mayor. And he ushered in the industrial era when it was really clear that Connecticut had to find a new basis for its economy, that it couldn't rely on its sort of indirect benefits from the slave trade. So
Right.
that's why, again, Connecticut was the last of the New England states to join the Civil War on the side of the Union, because its economy was so tied to slavery.
Mm.
But P.T. Barnum, and I contend that it's because of his contact with people in Little Liberia, clearly began to question these tenets of American society that said that Blacks were less. He got himself elected to state government just so that he could try to introduce legislation that would allow Black people to vote here.
Mm.
I don't believe he would have done that, except for, I'm saying it's my opinion, except for his ties to Little Liberia. His chef was a woman from Little Liberia. He had business transactions with folks in Little Liberia. When Little Liberians were asking for books for their library, Little Liberia had Bridgeport's first free lending library. He encouraged his friends who had their own private libraries to donate books. And on the day that the church was opened, he was there and made a donation. But more than that, I think he had meaningful interactions. There was a man named George Francis, who was actually from Haiti. So Little Liberia was became a mecca for people who had ideologies of liberation for Black people.
Right.
And it became a place where people came to, not just from the United States, but from the Caribbean. We also see testimony in some of these colored conventions by people who were born in Africa and then later on were free here. And it became a place where there was this dialogue, and people wrote about their opinions and why people should be free, and they did not bite their tongues. It was quite startling, actually. I mean, they just put it out there. And they had pamphlets, and they were always petitioning the government. Well, I believe that P.T. Barnum began to take notice of these things, and you see him start advocating with Abraham Lincoln, telling him that Black people should be able to fight in the Civil War, and that he, in fact, can raise, I forget the number, you have to forgive me, but I think he said he could raise 3,000 Black people for the Army if Abraham Lincoln would change that policy. So we see this change. But P.T. Barnum made tons of money, huge amounts of money. And so that's what you're kind of alluding to. So it would be sort of like someone being second in wealth to a Vanderbilt or something.
Right.
He was a self-made man, but he had a fortune. So for this woman, Mary Freeman, who kept a very low profile, to have had all that money, she could have lived anywhere. She could have built a mansion, but for some reason she did not.
Probably because she wanted to keep a low profile, as you mentioned, because she had seen what had happened to anything else that we've built. And I know this predates Tulsa and it predates Rosewood, but we know what happens we know what happened in those communities as it relates to whether they were burnt to the ground, whether Central Park, how it was flooded. And I'm certain that she realized that if I make them aware of how well we're doing, then there's going to be some resentment and envy from people from outside of our community that involves people who don't look like us, people who are still benefiting from the slave trade. And to see what it is I've been able to accumulate as far as this wealth, then that's going to give too many people of color too much encouragement and incentive to say, how can I be the next Mary Freeman? They didn't want that. And she probably knew that. And I've never met anyone who accumulated any amount of worth and they didn't have a high level of aptitude. So I'm sure the same holds true for her. This episode of Prepare for Takeoff is brought to you in part by Riverside, the platform that I trust to record studio quality podcasts right from my laptop. With Riverside, I get crystal clear audio and 4K video. Plus, it's super easy to use. Whether you're a beginner or a pro, Riverside helps your podcast sound amazing. Try it out for yourself. Click the affiliate link in our show notes and start recording like a pro with Riverside. Talk our viewers and listeners through like present day, what you're doing with the center and all of the things that you're preserving to make certain that this history isn't something that is erased from the history books and it gets the necessary recognition that it deserves.
So there was a man named Charles Brilvich. He's still alive and well, retired upstate New York. And in time, he became the city historian for the city of Bridgeport. But this was before he was even city historian. And, Bridgeport struggles economically. And this was in the 1980s. Yeah. They were trying to find some kind of a footing, economic footing, something that could be featured in Bridgeport that would bring investment here. And his training was in architectural history. He had to get his pants hemmed one day, and he had been through this neighborhood, noting how many historic structures there were. And he noticed that there was a Cuban tailor's and wanted to end his day there. Then he noticed that this shop was cobbled on to the front of a very old house, and an old house that didn't fit in architecturally with anything else in the area. Then he noticed it was right next to another house, the same size from the same period, and he just couldn't imagine what they were and why they were there. He does his research and he finds out that the houses belonged to these two sisters, Mary and Eliza Freeman. He wonders why he hasn't heard about it. He goes to a map that everybody goes to, and he finds that the houses in this community, unlike the houses further up north in Bridgeport, don't have the name of the owners next to them, because he thought he was just going to look and see who the owners were. But what he did notice that was different is that there were two black boxes that were labeled North African Church and South African Church. And this was an 1850 map. He was stunned, right? So years later, he gets these two houses with the help of the community, actually with the help of my uncle, which is another story because I did not find out about this through my uncle. And I didn't start doing this job because my uncle was like, all these things were like trying like little traps, trying to catch me and bring me here. But they got the houses listed on the National Register of Historic Places. And they thought, this is great. Here's something that really distinguishes Bridgeport. Everybody's going to celebrate this. The money's going to start rolling in. And that just didn't happen. They thought maybe a chamber of commerce or a wealthy individual, but no, it didn't happen. So the community starts advocating to save the houses because by that time, the houses are designated for demolition by the city. And people are saying these historic homes that were part of this community should not be demolished. What begins as a grassroots movement and the movement of employees from an agency called Action for Bridgeport Community Development, which was an anti-poverty program from the Johnson era, they find support from historians, from academics, from people who had lived in Bridgeport, white people who had ties with this neighborhood and then had moved to wealthy suburbs. All of a sudden, this movement comes together of people from different backgrounds, spearheaded by the local community, and we save these houses from demolition. We want to restore them. We want to restore them as other historic homes that tell narratives that are unique to the United States and significant in its history. We want to see these houses restored.
Mm-hmm.
That was a long time ago. We're still at it. But anyway, out of this restoration movement, this organization grew. So I founded the Mary and Eliza Freeman Center for History and Community in 2009. The people who sat on the first board represented the coalition that had saved the houses from demolition. And so at that time, we began our journey of trying to restore these homes. The idea was that the restoration of the Freeman houses would serve as a catalyst for development of the south end of Bridgeport, which, as I mentioned before, is low to middle income. And the neighborhood needs to attract investment. So we looked at these patterns of places throughout the United States that had used historic homes and neighborhoods as catalysts and had attracted development, but in a way that kept people in place and invited more people to join them. So instead of gentrifying, we wanted to focus on something that's called preservation-based equitable development. So you take the story, that story is compelling and fascinating to people, so they want to come and live in the area. You also start redoing and restoring other historic properties, and you have these main two that are so significant. They become the anchor of the neighborhood, both culturally and economically. So that's what we want to do. We want to restore the Little Liberia footprint. In the meantime, however, there's always street flooding and problems with that. And then we have hurricanes and blizzards, and then Superstorm Sandy really made the whole issue of sea level rise and climate change, it really drove it home because we experienced the strongest storm surge in all of the state. And we knew that we had to take it seriously. We had to protect the lives and the livelihoods and also keep this story, this historical story, up above water as well.
Mm-hmm.
Keep that from being drowned out. And we had learned from the past that changing landscapes also acts as a way of, well, actually, cultural genocide, which then again impacts the spirits of people and
Right.
takes away confidence and aspirations. So this footprint of this wonderful settlement that made so many contributions and such a difference, over the years, it became the center for industry and utility infrastructure. And so this history was literally buried underground.
Mm-hmm.
So if you change land use, you can destroy history and culture, and you can also demoralize a people.
Right.
We want to reverse that. So not only do we want to restore the houses, we want to restore the culture. And we also found ourselves as stewards of the environment, because when you abuse the environment, you exploit the environment, the people and the people who labor,
Mm-hmm.
you do damage to public health, you do damage to the planet itself. And we found that we not only had to be stewards for the history and stewards for the buildings, we had to focus on the environmental and ecological impact of poor land use. I'm happy to say now that we enjoy support from the city in terms of, they say, how can they help? We don't have to worry about demolition anymore, but To the extent that as a nation, we don't prioritize telling the full history, we don't prioritize the investment in infrastructure, and we don't prioritize education, there are just existential threats to us.
Right.
As a people, as a culture, and even to just the environment. So we want to clean up the environment. There are a lot of brownfields where we are now. We want to create just a really healthy and celebratory and uplifting neighborhood. We look at Little Liberia for lessons that we can learn, also for motivation and inspiration. Then we look at our life today through the lens of Little Liberia. So it's not just about fixing up a couple of old buildings. It's really about fixing up our society and fixing up the ground that we live on and the sea around us that is polluted.
As we close out, I wanted to give you the opportunity to share 3 things that you feel will help our viewers and listeners prepare for takeoff.
So first of all, you have to understand how deep our roots go in this country, and that in many respects, the people who came before us, they accomplished as much as we did and more. But because we don't know about it and teach about it, we forget that. We need to remember the accomplishments of the past. Little Liberia happened 100 years before Black Wall Street. The second thing is that we need to take leadership, both in the education of our children, and we need to take leadership in the way our story is told, not just to empower and heal ourselves, but to empower and heal the other populations of this nation. When people say, well, we don't want to hear this because it hurts us and it hurts our kids, they also ignore the progress that they as a people have made in achieving a higher level of humanity. There were times when Europeans were quite barbarous, but over the years, over time, they also developed a sense of humanity. And you can't talk about the achievements and the lengths to which people have improved if you deny the starting point.
Mm-hmm. That's a good point.
Right? I mean, there are wonderful humanitarians. And so our goal isn't just to vilify people, but to show that journey of redemption that folks like P.T. Barnum made over his lifetime, how he became a better human being who regarded people differently. That was a wonderful thing. He learned to make money, but he also learned to make peace and improvement. We need to celebrate those kinds of journeys. And I think the third thing that I want people to know, and I neglected to say, is that these centers, like the Freeman Center, which we want to build in the footprint of Little Liberia, we're not just having 2 houses as sort of dead memorials to a forgotten time. One home is going to be a community center that is focused on all the kinds of discussions and aspects that have to do with climate change and resilience, because it impacts us and our public health, and because the people back then actually tackled that. We're going to have a museum, a cultural, and a digital research center so that we can educate our own children. And we can share and celebrate our contributions with other people as well. So you want to be a resource. You want to be a leader. And you want to know your own history. And we all have to contribute to that. For people like me to do the work that I do, I have to be part of an ecosystem of people in my own culture. Because the investment bankers who went to Yale, they make a lot more money than I do. They're more likely to be able to write a big check that helps to make our dreams come true.
There's a lot of wealth in our community. It's just a matter of identifying where that wealth is and being able to educate those individuals about this story and the significance of Little Liberia, as well as the center and the purpose that it will serve in the community. So with all that being said, those investment bankers that maybe watching. I'm certain that there's people from Wall Street that are tied to my immediate network that can point us in the direction of where some of those resources may lie and how we can kind of figure out a way to navigate those up 95, similar to how our brothers and sisters and our ancestors were able to navigate those seas to bring resources from the South to the North. As far as us being free people, how can we bring some of those resources not as far north, but north nonetheless, as it pertains to the center? But with all that being said, where can they go? Website, social media handle, whatever you feel most comfortable with sharing to continue to tap in and hear more about what you're doing.
So we have a website, and you can learn more about Little Liberia and the Freeman Center and make donations. Our website is Freeman Center, BPT.org. So the BPT is for Bridgeport.
Okay.
And I can be reached through that website as well.
You have a wonderful story. We want to do what we can to help you tell that story and get that word out so we can attract some of those people, some of your former colleagues at Yale who ended up going to Wall Street instead of doing community work. So whatever we can do to help you, just consider that done, because as a people, we need to, again, pool our resources, and if not us, then who? So wanted to thank you once again for giving us so much of your time. Also, I wanted to thank our viewers and listeners, whether you're watching us on Spotify or YouTube, or whether you're listening on Amazon Music, Audible, Apple Podcasts, iHeart, or Pandora. As you know, every week we sit down with proven professionals and rising entrepreneurs, and all of these conversations, just like this one, will help you prepare for takeoff. Maisa, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.